when did you start this project? When was the first germ of an
I
idea?
first pitched it. I don't know when the first germ of the idea was, but I know that I first pitched it to John Lasseter at Pixar in September of 2011.
Okay.
So we've been working on this movie for the past 6 years.
Okay. And what do you now think? I know how creativity can be, but what do you now think was the germ, or what was the catalyst that got it past the point of an idea into let's do this?
Well, after we finished making Toy Story 3, I started thinking about what I wanted to do next, and I actually kicked around a few different ideas. John often likes to have us pitch him like 3 different ideas, so we're not putting all our eggs in one basket. And one of those 3 ideas that I pitched to John was the idea of telling a story set against Dia de Muertos. We didn't really know the story then at that point. The thing that I pitched to him was a very different story than we ended up making. But from the beginning, I was inspired by this beautiful tradition of Dia de Muertos. And when I spent time really learning about the details of the tradition and how people observe it, I discovered how central family is, the idea of family to Dia de Muertos. It's all about family remembrance and the obligation that we have to remember our loved ones after they're gone, and most importantly, to pass their stories along to the next generation so that their memories are never forgotten. And the more that I learned that, and the more that it kind of those ideas replaced maybe some of my preconceptions about what Dia de Muertos was all about, the more that I realized that we had the potential to tell a really rich story that not only had the potential to be a really entertaining film and really funny, colorful, hopefully visually dazzling, musical, but the family aspect of it is what convinced me that the film could have a real strong emotional core. Because we're always looking for that in our ideas, something that's going to have a lot of emotion.
So who was your next collaborator? Was it Darla? Was she assigned when you were developing?
Darla was with me from the beginning.
Okay.
Very beginning.
I assigned myself.
You assigned yourself? So when you're brought
As
on,
I do.
When you were brought onto this project, what was it, and then what was the process of kind of taking it to the next level and redeveloping it?
Well, we start with teeny tiny little teams, and we sit in these rooms for years on end, just working out the story. And really, it was, as Lee mentioned, it was after we were working on Toy Story 3, and it was Lee and I and our head of story, Jason Katz. And the first thing we did was we jumped on a plane and went down to Mexico. We took many trips down to Mexico, but that trip was very, very inspiring. And the most amazing and beautiful thing was the generosity, warmth, kindness, and inspiration of the people we hung out with. And it was very important to Lee from early on. He just kept saying, I just want to spend more time with the families, and I want to get to know their stories. And so anyway, we were fortunate enough to do that.
You mentioned the word musical, and I'm trying to think. This is a 19th Pixar film. Is this like the first thing that's the closest to a musical for Pixar?
I think it's the closest we've had so far.
Because it's just wall to wall, and it has so many different levels of music. So, Michael, you obviously had the score that you were worried about, and the, telling.
I wasn't so worried about it.
Yeah, well, that was your job too. But
He doesn't ever seem worried.
But there's also the idea of bringing in these songs, and also you have a specific culture and a culture that's layered with many different types of music. Could you talk about the beginning the music, and then bring who came in with the partnership and how all the different pieces fit together?
Well, on a film like this, when you're dealing with songs, usually the songs have to be written first. And I also want to mention, the song in the film, Remember Me. Those two guys aren't here tonight, Robert and Kristen Lopez, who wrote that song. And I got to give it up to them because they did such an amazing job with that song. So the songs usually come first. Now, and scores usually last. But in this case, I came in much earlier than I would have because it wasn't just score, it was also source music. So if he's running down the street, we wanted it to feel like he was really running down a street in this town in Mexico. What would you hear? There'd be musicians playing, there would be a radio over here, there'd be something going on there. We had to do all of that music so they could animate to that. So that was done very early on. And all of that music, what we call source music, was recorded down in Mexico. So we were planning this big trip to go down to Mexico City. record with Mexico's finest musicians, do all of this source music. I was so excited about it. And then I got pulled out of that trip because this was last year's when Star Wars happened. And so I was thrown onto that, and I had to, then Germaine kind of took over and headed down to Mexico City and did an amazing job producing all of the music that you heard in the streets and that the bands are playing and all of that. So I wrote it, handed it off, and then there's also some traditional music in there as well, which I know that she can speak to and talk about that. So that was first, then came the score after all that work was done.
So Germaine, I think you're responsible, correct me if I'm wrong, for making me smile right off the bat with the When You Wish Upon a Star having a mariachi feel. And then you also wrote a couple of songs with Adrian, Poco Loco, and a couple. So could you talk about working as a team to try and make this whole be a cohesive and arranging and having him go off to do Star Wars, and at the same time, I think you were communicating with each other, by Skype or whatever during that.
Yeah, I was getting a lot of videos. I was jealous. I was sitting on the stage recording, but I wanted to be there.
Such a hardship.
Look,
Okay, well, the logo was one of the first things I did, which was really fun to do, which was my assignment was make it sound like symphonic Mexico. And so, I tried a couple versions and that one stuck. But then I did some arrangements on Remember Me with Kristen Anderson Lopez and Robert Lopez, and then eventually started writing, which was a wonderful opportunity and Adrian wrote such poetic and beautiful lyrics that it was so easy to work with him. I loved what he sent, and I found it quite genuine and just inspired by the story. We would have all these conversations with, Lee, Darla, Adrian, and we would just talk about what they wanted in the scene, and I would send multiple, versions of demos, and then come back, get notes. And so that Un Poco Loco was one song that we also took to Mexico and recorded, which was really fun. We have one of the top jarocho groups called Mono Blanco is also playing on that, and also we put some mariachis on it. So it was really fun to work together.
What I loved about the process of recording in Mexico is that you bring in these, expert musicians, but you also you want the music to be inspired by the story, but you allow the story to be inspired by the music too. So instances where in Poco Loco, Germaine kind of in her demo started adding some zapateado, this footwork that she recorded, knocking shoes against wooden boards for the demo, and that started to inspire we could incorporate this into the character and pull Hector on stage and have him start dancing and bring a little bit of that Mexican folk dancing into this film, and all of it just lends itself to a richness and a reality and a history that I think makes the film feel timeless, but of a certain place and of a certain culture.
Lee talked about the animation of skeletons, which I think is a big difference for this film, and something you guys always seem to have something that you tackle that hasn't really been done before. So it seems like it would be simple, but on the other hand, I understand it isn't. Could you explain that a little bit?
Sure. There wasn't any one thing on this film that was kind of the big headline technical challenge to solve. It was more that this is a big film. It's enormous in scope. And
it feels very epic, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's a relatively small story, but it's set against this kind of epic landscape. We had to design and build the whole Land of the Dead, which was an enormous undertaking, and then populate that Land of the Dead with thousands and thousands of skeleton characters that needed to have clothing and lots of things that are, in small numbers aren't terribly difficult these days to do in computer graphics, but it was at such a scale that ended up being the challenge on this. But that being said, the skeletons themselves were a challenge. It was more a design challenge than a technical challenge. We knew there were going to be skeleton characters in the film from early on, and we wanted to design skeletons that weren't scary or off-putting. Because in our mind, they were just characters in the story. They were, in some cases, Miguel's own family members. So we didn't want them to be frightening in any way. I also made a choice very early on to give them eyeballs, which, right, that's kind of weird, right, for skeletons to have eyes. But now that you've seen the
Don't
film,
think about it too much.
I just knew in that scene where Miguel and Hector are down in the cenote in the cave, I knew I was going to be in a big close-up of Hector with the camera pushing in, and I needed the audience to be emotionally connected with him and to see him as a person with a soul. And I couldn't imagine doing that without eyes. And so we made that decision early on. And then beyond that, it was just, there were technical things about figuring out how to have the skeletons be able to break apart and come back together, and that was really hard. And there was a core group, a small group of animators that were really good at that, so we would give them the hardest shots. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.